The moment didn't arrive with a parade or a presidential announcement. It arrived quietly, through permit filings, freight movements, and early test footage that disappeared as quickly as it surfaced. But for those who track energy and mobility closely, the signal was unmistakable. America had moved first. Not with louder batteries, not with faster charging, but with something far more disruptive: electric vehicles that no longer behaved like they depended on the grid at all. For years, the global EV race followed a predictable script. China scaled manufacturing. America focused on software. Europe tightened regulation. Everyone assumed the finish line would be crossed somewhere in Asia, backed by supply chains optimized to the millimeter. That assumption just broke. Sources close to pilot programs describe vehicles operating beyond expected range limits, weeks, not hours, without conventional charging events. No new charging stations. No visible infrastructure rollout. Just cars that kept moving. At first, analysts dismissed it as accounting tricks. Auxiliary generators. Short-range demos. Controlled environments designed to impress, not endure. But the behavior persisted. Across climates. Across routes. Across usage patterns that don't forgive shortcuts. What makes this moment uncomfortable isn't the technology itself. It's the timing. China wasn't supposed to be second. Not on energy systems. Not on electric mobility. Not after 2 decades of strategic investment. And yet, by the time public awareness began to form, American prototypes were already transitioning out of test fleets. Not announced. Deployed. Behind the scenes, the language used wasn't self-powered in marketing memos. It was more cautious. Words like resilience, autonomy, load independence. Terms carefully chosen to survive legal scrutiny. But the implication was clear enough to ripple through global supply desks. If these systems scale, charging networks stop being choke points. And when choke points disappear, leverage evaporates. Utilities begin asking different questions. Cities rethink infrastructure budgets that assumed exponential charger growth. Fleet operators quietly pause long-term charging contracts they haven't signed yet. At the heart of it is a simple shift, almost invisible unless you know where to look. Energy is no longer treated as something the vehicle consumes. It's treated as something the vehicle participates in. These cars behave less like endpoints on a grid and more like active nodes, harvesting, balancing, reusing microflows that were previously ignored as noise or loss. No single source explains the endurance. It's the orchestration that matters. Which is why this didn't come from a press conference. It came from integration. That's also why reactions from Beijing were restrained. No denials. No counter-announcements. Just a sudden increase in internal reviews, redirected funding, and a noticeable change in tone from state-linked analysts who had been calling Western EV tech incremental just months earlier. Because when a breakthrough doesn't announce itself, it's harder to attack. You can't sanction a concept that hasn't been named. And that may be the most strategic part of all this. America didn't declare victory in the EV race. It changed the racetrack. Shifted the definition of dependence. Forced competitors to prepare responses to a system that doesn't play by the old rules of input and consumption. The public still thinks the story is about cars. It's not. It's about what happens when mobility stops waiting for permission from infrastructure. When energy independence goes mobile. When strategy rolls onto roads instead of staying buried in policy papers. And as more of these vehicles quietly enter circulation, unmarked, unbranded, indistinguishable from any other EV, the question isn't whether China will respond. What's happening now isn't mass rollout, it's positioning. Strategic corridors. Specific states. Select logistics routes where energy resilience matters more than public attention. These vehicles are being placed where outages, weather disruptions, and grid strain used to be limiting factors. And suddenly, those limits don't apply. Data from these corridors is feeding something much larger. Patterns of independence. How often vehicles truly need external input. How behavior changes when drivers aren't managing range anxiety. How fleets operate when downtime stops being tied to plugs and schedules. This isn't just performance testing, it's behavioral mapping. And the results are already unsettling legacy assumptions. Mileage stops correlating with cost. Route optimization shifts from charger density to terrain and flow. Fleet managers begin running scenarios that were considered economically irrational just a year ago. Longer routes, faster cycles, smaller buffers. In other words, efficiency stops obeying old constraints. That's a problem for anyone whose business model depends on those constraints staying in place. Utilities notice first. Because fewer charging events don't just mean lower usage, they mean unpredictability. Planning a grid assumes demand curves. Self-powered vehicles flatten those curves in ways planners don't yet know how to model. Charging network investors notice next. Utilization rates soften. Expansion timelines slide. Projects that once felt inevitable suddenly need new justifications. Then comes the quiet political tension. If vehicles can operate independently during blackouts, storms, or cyber incidents, they stop being transportation assets and start resembling resilience infrastructure. And countries treat resilience infrastructure very differently from consumer products. This is where the careful language becomes crucial. No one is calling these vehicles energy independent. No one is claiming they break thermodynamics. The systems are described as load-balanced, ambient-optimized, self-sustaining within defined operational envelopes. Technically cautious. Strategically explosive. Because once you admit that a mobile platform can sustain itself under defined conditions, you've crossed a line. You've decoupled mobility from centralized vulnerability. And the rest of the world sees that line very clearly. China's response won't be loud. It never is at first. It will be methodical. Research consolidation. Silent acquisition. Policy adjustments timed to look coincidental rather than reactive. Europe will debate standards. India will explore leapfrogging. Resource-exporting nations will reassess leverage they assumed was permanent. All of this triggered by vehicles that don't ask to be plugged in as often as they're supposed to. And still, the public narrative lags behind reality. Headlines argue about range improvements and battery chemistry, unaware that the conversation already advanced to orchestration, autonomy, and systemic independence. By the time official announcements arrive, they'll describe something that's been operational for months. That's how real shifts happen. Not when participants are convinced, but when their models stop working. And as the first wave of these self-sustaining vehicles blends into everyday traffic, looking ordinary, behaving anything but, the world edges closer to a moment where mobility quietly escapes the gravitational pull of centralized energy altogether. And that's where the stakes begin to escalate. Because the first ripple of operational independence soon spreads into networks, data streams, and human behavior. Fleet operators begin noticing that routing constraints they once considered unavoidable, charging stations, peak demand hours, grid outages, no longer dictate schedules. Drivers, too, start experimenting with longer trips, unconventional routes, and energy-sharing strategies, unknowingly participating in what's becoming a living, adaptive system. Meanwhile, analysts outside the U.S. scramble to understand the implications. Spreadsheets no longer predict energy demand accurately. Forecasts of grid load, battery supply, and fleet efficiency fail to account for autonomous energy feedback loops now quietly embedded in thousands of vehicles. Each vehicle doesn't just move, it learns, adapts, and reports back, forming a decentralized intelligence network invisible to traditional oversight. Beijing takes notice, but publicly remains cautious. Internal memos reportedly describe the U.S. initiative as unprecedented and challenging to quantify. Plans to accelerate domestic self-powered EV programs are quietly drafted, yet by the time they begin testing, the American fleets will already have months of operational experience. This is not just competition, it's a strategic lead that compounds every day. At the same time, American policymakers are quietly assessing the national security angle. Vehicles that can operate independently in emergencies, natural disasters, or energy disruptions are more than transport, they're mobile resilience units. This dual-use potential changes the conversation about infrastructure, emergency planning, and even defense logistics, yet the public narrative continues to focus on battery range and acceleration statistics. The psychological impact on consumers is subtle but profound. Confidence grows not in the number of charging stations available, but in the vehicle itself. Anxiety over power loss diminishes. A new baseline of expectation emerges, mobility that functions reliably even when infrastructure falters. And as that baseline becomes normalized, pressure builds on other manufacturers to adapt or risk irrelevance. This is the turning point where the EV race stops being about horsepower, cost, or market share. It becomes about autonomy, adaptability, and systemic influence. Whoever controls the design, the software, and the feedback loops holds leverage far beyond the vehicle itself. Traditional competitive metrics no longer apply. And as these self-powered fleets continue to expand quietly, seamlessly, and without fanfare, the rest of the world faces a stark reality. The rules of mobility have changed. The US isn't just leading in production, it's rewriting the blueprint for energy, transportation, and strategic advantage simultaneously. And the visibility will come in stages, subtle at first, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Analysts will note shifts in energy demand curves. Fleet operators will quietly report fewer disruptions. Insurance models will begin to change as self-powered EVs demonstrate resilience traditional vehicles cannot match. By then, the advantage isn't hypothetical, it's operational, embedded, and compounding. China and other competitors will respond, but the US lead will already be measured in months of real-world deployment. It's one thing to produce a prototype in a lab. It's another to have thousands of vehicles silently proving a concept on streets, highways, and logistical corridors. Each mile driven, each route completed without reliance on traditional infrastructure, adds credibility that marketing alone cannot manufacture. Meanwhile, the human element begins to adapt. Drivers learn to trust the systems in ways they never had to before. Maintenance teams evolve into monitoring and predictive analytics units. Cities start noticing subtle reductions in peak loads and traffic-induced grid stress. None of this is flashy. None of it makes headlines. But it changes behavior, policy, and expectations in ways that compound silently over time. By the time the global media catches on, the narrative will have already shifted. What was once framed as a technology story, batteries, efficiency, charging, will become a systemic story: autonomy, resilience, and strategic influence. And those who were slow to understand will find themselves reacting, rather than leading. The quiet, continuous deployment becomes a proving ground for the larger vision, a world where mobility is untethered from centralized energy infrastructure, where cities, fleets, and individuals gain unprecedented operational freedom, where the leverage in transportation and energy isn't held by fuel suppliers or grid operators, but by those who control adaptive, self-sustaining systems. And in that emerging world, the concept of competition is redefined. It is no longer a race for units sold or miles covered. It is a race for trust, reliability, and systemic mastery. Whoever wins that race reshapes mobility for decades to come. As American self-powered vehicles continue to operate silently, consistently, and adaptively, the stage is set for a global reckoning. Not in headlines, not in announcements, but in the quiet realization that the mobility landscape has already shifted, irreversibly, strategically, and ahead of everyone who thought they could catch up. Imagine a world where your car never needs to be plugged in, never stops to recharge, and yet keeps running endlessly. Sounds like science fiction? Well, America just brought that vision to life, and the entire electric vehicle industry is reeling. In a move that has stunned automakers worldwide, self-powered electric cars have officially hit U.S. roads, months ahead of China, the country long hailed as the leader in EV innovation. These vehicles don't rely on traditional charging infrastructure. Instead, they harness a groundbreaking energy system that generates power on the go, creating what experts are calling the end of range anxiety. For decades, electric cars were limited by battery life, charging stations, and technological constraints, but now that narrative is being rewritten entirely. Industry insiders are scrambling to understand the technology behind this leap. Early tests revealed that these cars can generate enough energy while in motion to sustain themselves indefinitely under normal driving conditions. This isn't just about convenience, it's a seismic shift in how we think about transportation, energy consumption, and even climate impact. Analysts warn that this could dramatically disrupt the global EV market. Tesla, which has dominated the conversation around electric mobility, now faces unprecedented competition, not just from established automakers, but from entirely new players capable of leapfrogging conventional EV limitations. Investors are paying close attention, with stocks in both traditional automakers and EV startups showing volatility as speculation about the technology spreads. The implications extend far beyond just the US. If these self-powered vehicles scale, countries with limited charging infrastructure could adopt EVs at a pace previously unimaginable, bypassing one of the biggest hurdles in global electrification. Imagine Africa, Southeast Asia, or Latin America suddenly being able to deploy a fleet of electric cars without investing billions in charging networks. Critics, of course, remain skeptical. Questions about safety, long-term reliability, and environmental impact of the new technology abound. Yet the engineers behind this breakthrough insist that rigorous testing has been conducted and preliminary results show both safety and efficiency exceeding current EV standards. The world is watching as America, long seen as a latecomer in some aspects of EV innovation, pulls ahead with a disruptive technology that could redefine global mobility. And while China accelerates its own advancements, it's clear that the race is no longer about building more EVs. It's about building the right kind of EV, one that can power itself and change the rules of the game entirely. Experts suggest that this development is just the beginning. Patents are being filed, prototypes are being tested in controlled environments, and whispers of partnerships between American innovators and global manufacturers hint at a rapid scale-up. If all goes according to plan, self-powered cars could be commercially available within the next year, marking a moment in history that future generations will look back on as the dawn of a truly autonomous energy era. And while the global industry recalibrates, ordinary drivers are already dreaming of a life free from charging stations and electric anxiety. For the first time, the promise of electric vehicles is not just green, it's unstoppable. The age of self-powered electric vehicles isn't coming, it's already here. America's breakthrough has sent shockwaves through the global auto industry, challenging assumptions, rewriting rules, and proving that innovation knows no borders. Whether you're an investor, a car enthusiast, or just someone dreaming of a future free from charging stations, one thing is clear: the road ahead will never be the same. Buckle up, because the revolution in mobility has begun, and the first self-powered cars are leading the charge.